Go ahead and start the recording, Deborah. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the stakeholder engagement workshop regarding the Southwestern Public Service Company's IRP. It's Tuesday, the 3rd of October, and we are recording this meeting for the benefit of those who may not be here and want to listen in, or for anyone who wants to review any of the conversation at a later date. I'm joined by my colleagues Jay Griffin and Deborah Shields. This is Margie Tatro with GridWorks, and we're pleased to be working with the SPS team on this project. And I would like to go ahead and describe to you what our plan is for today. And then we'll have a pause for a few comments that Arthur O'Donnell from the New Mexico PRC would like to share with this group. So welcome again, and thank you for your engagement. What we plan to do today is have an update from the SPS team on their progress regarding the statement of need and the action plan. And our goal today is to hear again from stakeholders about any comments you might have, try to identify places where there are agreements or unresolved issues on both of those documents, as they are two key deliverables from this facilitated stakeholder process that is new for the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission. So we'll spend the first hour on the statement of need, take a break, and then the second hour on the action plan. We realize that some of those conversations may be integrated because they are at times an interdependent kind of conversation. And then we'll summarize the next steps, ask for your feedback from this meeting, and adjourn by 3:30. So the next slide describes really in a few words what we hope to accomplish today. As I mentioned, update all the stakeholders on the progress regarding statement of need and action plan, assess the level of agreement on both of those pieces. And we also want to prepare you all, the stakeholders, to provide us with feedback later in October on this overall facilitated stakeholder process to inform the IRP. So we'll give you just a few thoughts about that and invite you to the final meeting that we've scheduled in October. And of course, that will occur after SPS has filed their IRP. We'll give you some time to express your thoughts about what could be better in this process, what worked well for you or not, going into the final steps. So with that, let me pause and ask first, are there any questions of people on the call about what we're planning to do today? We'll entertain those questions, and then we'll ask Arthur O'Donnell to share a few remarks with us. So any questions so far? Please either come off mute or put your hand up, or any way that we can see that you would like to speak, please do so. I don't see any hands up or hear any voices. So Arthur, thank you so much for joining us. Let me let you take the floor and share any remarks you'd like to with the group.
Thank you very much, Margie. Thank you, GridWorks. Thank you, SPS. And most especially, thank you to all of you who have been participating in this. This is, as you know, a first-time use of a new process that stems from the Commission's revision to the Integrated Resource Planning Rule last year. And we're happy to see that we're reaching a significant milestone in reaching the end of the stakeholder engagement process. For those of you who don't know me, I am the Director of Policy Administration for the PRC. I do not speak for the commissioners, right? We're not deciding anything now, but I have talked over with the chair of the commission, Pat O'Connell, about expressing our thanks. And also, just two things that Margie raised is that part of today's will be to assess the level of agreement with the statement of need and the action plan. And the commission is really very interested in parties reaching as much agreement as possible before the filing of the IRP. That was the whole intent of moving a stakeholder engagement process to the beginning of this before a filing, so that everybody would have the opportunity to participate and to bring your ideas and question the utilities. And all accounts that I've heard tells me that it's been successful on that front. Maybe not always comfortable for everybody, but successful. And that's what we're looking for. I want to very briefly share my screen in terms of what to expect next. And I know that GridWorks will reify this at the end of the day. So I'm going to open up what are just some language from the final rule. Can everybody see what's on my screen? And we're looking at, looking at the wrong thing. Sorry, bear with me. What I want to talk about is the filing of the IRP, and I believe that this is it, right? SPS, as a result of the variance request that the commission granted, is actually looking at filing their IRP sooner than it states in the rule, and we're expecting a filing as quickly as next week, which will seriously expedite the process. Parties still have the opportunity to provide comments on the IRP, and those written comments may include the commenter's own draft statement of need and action plan for commission review, right? Public comments will be made as addendums to the IRP and in the filing. And then the utility has 60 days to respond to that and to talk about whether it's adopting any of the written comments or reasons why they do or do not. The commission utility staff, which has been participating in this stakeholder engagement all along, it will consider both the filing and the written comments and provide their response with a statement 90 days, within 90 days of the IRP. Of course, it could be sooner if there's really nothing to talk about. And if the commission is not acted within 120 days of the filing of the IRP, the statement of need, action plan are deemed accepted and compliant, and the utility would move forward with its action plan. If the commission, for some reason, based on comments, decides that there's some deficiency, that the statement of need or action plan do not comply with requirements, then the commission shall identify the deficiencies and return the filing to the utility with instructions for refiling, maybe corrections, maybe adding something. All in all, we kind of want to avoid that, right? Well, as the utility has indicated, it is facing a serious need, and we're appreciative of all the effort that goes into defining that need and then taking the steps to move forward with meeting that need, and that's what we're here for. So again, this doesn't preclude any opportunity to provide further comments as specified in the rule. You will notice that the commission does not have a decision point in terms of adopting the IRP, except to accept it and deem it compliant, right? That was determined when we did the rule revision, and we think that that's a process that will help expedite actual kind of moving forward with this. So I'm happy to answer any questions about our process, but really, GridWorks and the utility are well prepared to also answer those questions. So with that, I want to thank Margie. I want to thank everyone at GridWorks and all of the utility personnel who've been working on this. And again, especially to those of you who've been participating in this. We know it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of thought, and I think that everything that we know from around the country is that planning processes like this greatly benefit from this kind of stakeholder engagement and helps avoid the conflict that traditionally came after a utility filed something with the commission before moving ahead with procuring resources. And that's exactly our hope today. So thank you.
Thank you,
Stopping
Margie.
sharing.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for being here and for your support. Do people have questions for Arthur? Please raise your hand or come off mute and ask your question if there are any questions of Arthur.
Hearing none, I will slink off into anonymity and watch the proceedings. Thanks again.
We greatly appreciate your being here. Thank you. Great. So our next piece of business is to hear from SPS on their latest update regarding the statement of need. Many of you were at our last meeting where statement of need and action plan were discussed, and much of your feedback was very helpful. In fact, all your feedback was helpful. I will now turn the meeting over to Zoe Leese and Ben Elsey and the SPS team. Zoe, I'm not sure who's your presenter, but we'll have you present. And I think Linda's going to share your slide deck. I guess I'd like to ask that we go through the conversation about statement of need, and then we'll pause and have that conversation so that after the break, we'll come back to the action plan slides. So Zoe, over to you.
Thanks, Margie, and thank you everyone for participating today and for your continued engagement in our stakeholder engagement process over the last 6 months. We really value the input and appreciate you taking the time to join us in this process. Ben Elsey is going to present the statement of need slides. Margie and Jay, I think I had mentioned to you this week that Ben has a hard stop in about 20 minutes. So he'll present them, and then we have myself is available for questions and discussions. I believe we also have a few other people from SPS on as well that can tee up to help. So I'll pass it over to Ben to give him the most time as he can.
Thank you, Zoe. I'm also going to ask, because the material that you all are seeing today came in rather late yesterday, we're going to give people the opportunity to ask questions as they arise to stakeholders. I know in the past we've waited to the end of the presentation for conversation, and we think it's very important that stakeholders digest and understand this information in real time. So then Jay and I will have a look at the chat for questions, and also people, stakeholders, if you do have a question in the moment, please raise your hand. We want to try to get the most understanding of this information while you're here and while Ben is with us. Thank you. Ben, over to you.
Sure, thank you everyone. I'm going to go and turn my video off because the slides are pretty small. I'm going to get up close and personal to my screen. So, okay, so I think we've already mentioned throughout the course of these stakeholder meetings that in 2022, we issued an RFP as a result of our 2021 updated IRP action plan. And as part of the 2022 RFP, we have filed or requested permission to procure some additional resources that should see us through for a capacity need through 2027. Then as we look further out through the rest of this decade, 28, 29, and 2030, we have a growing capacity need. And that capacity need is anywhere between 1,760 megawatts on the low end. So that was our financial forecast, our most conservative forecast, all the way up to 3,963 megawatts on the higher end. That 3,968 megawatts was based on our electrification and emerging technologies forecast. And just to reiterate, that forecast actually came from a group of our stakeholders who put forward that as a request. So as we look at that very large capacity need of anywhere between kind of 1,800 and 4,000 megawatts, when we look at the resources that will fulfill that need, it's very much dependent upon the technologies that are available for selection. So if we look at the multi-jurisdictional baseline, which includes essentially new gas generation, we're on the lower end of that scale. We need about 5,300 megawatts to fulfill that capacity need. Then as we look on the higher end of that range and we start looking at just kind of the existing commercially available carbon-free technologies, which are namely wind, solar, 4, 6, and 8 hour lithium-ion batteries, then we start seeing a resource need of anywhere between up to around 10,200 megawatts. Because it takes several years to get those new resources online, even though we're looking at a resource need in 28 and through 2030, we need to start that procurement as soon as possible. So we anticipate after filing this IRP, in the next week or so, that we will be issuing an RFP for these new resources sometime towards the middle of next year, maybe June, July, sort of around the summer sort of time. And we'll be looking at procuring those resources to meet that capacity need that I mentioned. So then as we kind of step down through the remainder of this slide, just to kind of reiterate on kind of the main modeling inputs and assumptions, the need is driven by 3 different load forecasts. We have the most conservative, which is the financial forecast, the intermediate or the medium forecast, which is the planning forecast, and then we have kind of the stakeholder-driven electrification emerging technologies forecast. The size of the resources that we need to procure is dependent upon the technology cases. So if we kind of talked about these throughout the course of these meetings as bookends, if we look on one bookend being the multi-jurisdictional baseline, where we have new gas generation, then on the other end of the scale, we have just existing commercially available technologies. And then we also did 2 scenarios that kind of have emerging technology assumptions. So we looked at long duration storage, which is 100-hour energy storage. And then also a case where we assumed the new gas generation would be converted to a clean fuel. We've been calling it hydrogen. I think that could be used interchangeably for any alternative clean fuel. So then as we look at the modeling, we kind of broke down the resources that we need into 2 distinct categories. We have renewable energy resources, which are essentially renewable clean energy resources. And we have anywhere between a 4,300 megawatt to 6,600 megawatt need for new wind and solar. And then we also have a need for dispatchable generation or dispatchable resources. When we talk about dispatchable resources, we're essentially talking about resources that can be dispatched when they're called upon. So they can provide electricity when needed. When we look at the need for dispatchable, we're looking anywhere between 1,000 megawatts on the low end of the financial forecast, all the way up to 4,300 megawatts on the high end. Included within that dispatchable resource category is energy storage, and we just broke that out to a separate bullet point here. Those scenarios include anywhere between 10 megawatts all the way up to 4,300 megawatts of battery energy storage resources. And I think the kind of maybe the final sentence on this slide is perhaps one of the most important. We've talked about this time and time again throughout the IRP stakeholder process. All of the kind of above assumptions are based on generic modeling. So generic cost assumptions, generic technical characteristics. We will firm up all of this modeling based on an RFP that I mentioned earlier that we would issue next year. So the actual resources that will be selected will be subject to them, 1, turning up to an RFP, and 2, the costs that are bid into the RFP. And then one other thing I just kind of maybe want to add that's not clear on this slide is when we look at this capacity need, this is based on the load forecasts as they stand today. So the financial plan and electrification forecast. When we issue the RFP in the next summer, our intention would be to update the load forecast. So we're going to be 6 months to 8 months further down the line, hopefully going to be able to maybe firm up some of these load forecast assumptions a little bit, and then hopefully narrow that band from kind of at the moment, the 5,000 to 10,000 megawatts. As we update the load forecast, we're hoping we can tighten that range slightly. If we just go on to the next slide, please, Zoe, or Linda. Here is a result of the modeling. And this really just shows you everything that I just described. So I won't go through it all now. We've been through this slide many, many times over the course of these meetings. But again, just starting from top, going down to the bottom. At the top, we have our financial forecast. So as I mentioned, our most conservative forecasts. We have the 2 different plan and reserve margin assumptions, the existing 15%, and then the 18% summer, 20% winter. And then you see the resources that are selected by the Encompass model for each of those scenarios. So just picking one, for example, if we were to look at the existing technologies under a 15% plan and reserve margin assumption. It shows the addition of 1,380 megawatts of dispatchable resources, in this case, battery energy storage, and then 4,500 megawatts of new renewable generation, 3,500 megawatts of wind, and slightly over 1,000 megawatts of solar. And then as you step down through the forecasts, obviously as the forecasts go up with a planning forecast, higher load, higher energy requirements mean you need additional resources to meet that need. And then finally, as I mentioned, we have the electrification emerging technologies forecast at the bottom. Again, I'm not going to step through each of these numbers. We've presented these on several occasions. So I'll go to the next slide.
Ben, before you do, 2 questions to help our stakeholders interpret, if you could go back. One, is this table going to be included in the statement of need? And second question, can you clarify the definition of firm peaking in this table, please?
Yeah, so in the IRP document itself, this table is included in section 9 at a minimum. And then we also have several kind of more granular views of this table. So there's going to be, this information is going to be provided many, many times. On this table, as you're looking at firm peaking, this refers to either combustion turbine generators, so CTs, and then in the cases that we're not presenting here, we don't actually see them, but you'll see them in the IRP document. We also did some scenarios where we included reciprocating engines. I believe those resources are also under the category of firm peaking. So it should include CTs and reciprocating engines.
Thank you.
So now as we look further out, essentially we've got the same modeling, so the same load forecast assumptions, the same technology assumptions, but now we're looking throughout the 20-year planning period. So we're looking all the way through 2043. And again, our starting point is 2028 based on the fact that our 2022 RFP is going to solve our capacity need through 27. So now it's really the same the same story, but just more on steroids. You're just looking further out. So now when you look at our resource need, it's anywhere between 12,600 megawatts on the low end, all the way up to 2,400 megawatts, 24,000 megawatts, excuse me, on the high end. And that again is driven by those 2 assumptions: load forecast, the higher load forecast, more resources needed, and then also the technologies that are available. If you start excluding gas and you start replacing that just with, say, 4 to 8 hour lithium ion batteries, you need more capacity, you need more installed capacity to maintain system reliability. So then again, if you go down to kind of the last 3 bullet points on this slide, we have anywhere between 7,800 all the way up to just shy of 14,000 megawatts of new variable energy resources, so new wind, new solar, renewable generation. And then you have anywhere between kind of 4,500 megawatts all the way up to 11,200 megawatts of dispatchable resources. Again, dispatchable resources, we're talking CTs, reciprocating engines, battery energy storage, long-term, long-duration energy storage. And then within that category, oh, and I've just lost the slide. Margie, are you able to see the slide right now?
It appears that Linda got kicked off of the Zoom. So I can share my screen if I have that capability. I don't know if I do.
Great. If you don't, I can call it up. So Zoe, give you first try at that.
Yeah, how about you call it up? It's not working for me.
All right. Stand by just a moment. Okay, I can share. Got it back up. Hold on. Okay, can you see this now?
I can, thank you.
Thanks, Margie.
Sure.
Yeah, so as I was just saying, we have anywhere between 4,500 megawatts to 11,200 megawatts of dispatchable resource need through 2043. Included within those numbers, our modeling shows energy storage anywhere between 130 megawatts on the very, very low side, all the way up to the 11,200 megawatts. So that full dispatchable need if you're only including storage. So if we now go to the next slide, please, Margie. And now if you look at kind of the same table as we presented before, now we're looking all the way through 28 to 43. This is kind of abbreviated. So we've got the plan and forecast at the top. Sorry for switching the orders on you. And then the electrification in the middle and the financial forecast at the bottom. I believe all of these are presented with the 15% plan and reserve margin requirement. And then the categories on the left-hand side is the multi-jurisdictional baseline, the existing technologies, long duration storage, and then the hydrogen conversion cases. So again, I'll just pick one. I'll use the same examples I gave earlier. We look at the plan and forecast, the way to read this table, plan and forecast, 15% PRM, under existing commercially available carbon-free technologies. You have no gas generation, of course. You have 10,390 megawatts of battery energy storage, and then just shy of 10,000 megawatts of wind and 2,800 megawatts of solar. So total is around about 10,500 megawatts of dispatchable generation, 12,500 megawatts of renewable generation, a total of 23,000 megawatts of new generation through 2043. Again, just keep in mind, this is all based on generic modeling that would be subject not only to the RFP that we're issuing next year, but several future RFPs that we issue through the 2020s and the early 2030s, all the way up to 2043. So Zoe, I'll pause there. It may be before I kind of hand it over to the objectives, Zoe, maybe where I hand it back to you just because I've got to jump off. Do we have any questions where we're up, Margie, Jay?
I'm not seeing any yet. Do you, Jay?
Nope, I haven't seen it. Nothing in the chat.
So yeah, please proceed, Ben.
Okay, so if we go to the next slide. And then Zoe, are you okay if I hand the baton over to you at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to make sure, since we have Ben on right now, that there aren't any questions. I know we just opened it up, but I'll open it up one more time. Okay. Oh, looks like something might have come through on the chat. Oh, okay, never mind. Not a question for you, Ben. Well, thank you, Ben. We also are including in the statement of need objectives that we see the utility needing to keep in mind as it goes forward with this resource planning process. And this is informed by our requirements, our system requirements, and what we've heard from you all during this engagement process. So I don't need to go through maybe all of these, but these are all themes that we've been talking about throughout the stakeholder engagement process. Ensuring reliability and resiliency on the system, bringing forward a cost-effective resource portfolio for our customers, meeting the RPS requirements, while considering the guardrails of affordability and system reliability, meeting projected load growth, and securing replacement energy and capacity for retiring resources, meeting evolving resource adequacy requirements. You see that we've presented the two PRM options, 15% and 18%. We need to make sure that we're resource planning for what that PRM ends up being, ensuring affordability to all SPS customers, including residential and low-income customers, as the system transitions, providing a just and orderly transition for the workforce, customers, and communities. And that includes considering replacement generation in communities affected by accelerated retirements, and engaging customers to help the utility reliably serve the grid, during grid constrained events. So those are some of the objectives that we'll be identifying in the statement of need in the IRP. And that's it from me, Margie. I don't know if we're ready to go on to the action plan. And also Linda is back on the call. She got dropped. But if you'd like to hand it over to her to present, we can do that as well, Margie, if that's easier for you.
Great. I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you, Zoe. And I'm going to ask Deborah to please put back up the GridWorks spreadsheet, because there were some specific comments from stakeholders about the statement of need that we would now like to review, and going to hear how those issues have been considered by SPS. So you will see on our slide deck here, we pulled those items that were input from stakeholders during the last meeting. And so we'd like to talk about at this point, and we will go to the individuals who raised these questions to see how they feel about how the issue has been addressed and what they've heard today. Before we do that, let me point out that we have allowed conversation today in this meeting, and we are going to take any additional comments from people up through noon on Friday of this week. If you have comments or concerns about any of the material presented today, for the sheer reason of you may be wanting to confer with your colleagues and such, if you didn't get a chance to look at the information before the meeting, we want to give you an opportunity to provide any additional comment. But we would like to hear from you primarily today so that the other stakeholders can benefit from the conversation. So don't be bashful today. And if you need to, take advantage of the email comments to us by this Friday at noon as well. So back to there were four main issues raised by stakeholders during the last meeting. First was to clarify which dispatchable resources are contributing to the capacity need. And that, so that was one. The second was a comment about at least one stakeholder suggesting that fossil-based resources should not be part of the dispatchable option, or for reasons of carbon emissions. And we'd like to know how you've dealt with that. Also, there was quite a bit of conversation about the mid and high end ranges of the resource need. Like to know if that's been resolved. And then finally, we had input about mentioning the role of demand side resources in the statement of need. So those are four things that we would like to hear now, how those have been addressed. And then I will call on a number of stakeholders who raised those issues to see if they feel like they've been addressed. So Zoe, over to you and Ben to respond if Ben is still here, but ask you to lead this response.
Thanks, Margie. And I'm going to take the first two together. In the September 13th stakeholder meeting, two stakeholders had requested that the term dispatchable resources be further described as including three scenarios: lithium ion storage, long duration storage, and new gas generation with future conversion to hydrogen. And as the bullet point identifies, one stakeholder also expressed a preference for scenarios without future fossil fuel-based resources. So SPS, as Ben said, will be issuing an RFP if all goes according to plan in the middle of next year. It is SPS's position that, according to the rule, we need to be presenting the most cost-effective portfolio to the commission within, obviously, the legal requirements as set up by the state. And that if we put guardrails around the term dispatchable, we might not get bids in that RFP that would put forward the most cost-effective resource. So we can't limit our definition of dispatchable in the RFP in order to provide that information to the commission. So the RFP issued next year will be an all-source RFP that's includes dispatchable resources, and the evaluation of the RFP bids will determine what the resources are in in the portfolio that we put forward for approval by the commission.
So Zoe, let me add to that. I think also the table that Ben provided, which lists those variety of dispatchable options, is it also satisfies this particular comment from stakeholders. Do you not agree?
Yeah, we've modeled many different sensitivities and scenarios in this, and we've identified specific dispatchable resources and what those scenarios do to the modeling.
So let me have you pause there. And there were 3 stakeholders, actually 4 stakeholders, who are interested in this particular comment. And if they are on the call, I'd like to invite them to comment on the response. That was Athena Christodoulou, Chris Leger, Jeffrey Pollock, and Michael Kenny all had a comment or a consideration of this particular bullet. So do any of those folks, Athena, Michael, Chris, or Jeffrey, any of you who are on the call like to comment about that?
You guys hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I am not Jeffrey Pollock. I'm Jonathan Lee, standing in on his behalf for
Okay.
OPL.
Welcome, Jonathan.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to note that we're in support of SPS's approach to take an all-source RFP and really take that, to task to consider all resource options available.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks, Jonathan. Okay. Margie, are you ready for me to move on?
Yeah, the second bullet, though, on fossil-based resource response, I think your response it was good. It required some interpretation. So let me see if I think I interpret what you say. If SPS were to limit their resources to non-fossil based, that there are serious concerns about affordability and reliability by doing that. Am I interpreting you correctly?
Well, what I said, Margie, is in the RFP, we don't want to limit what we allow to be bid in as a dispatchable resource, because we want to be able to see what all resources are that come into that RFP. And that puts us in the best position to ensure a portfolio that that considers affordability and reliability. That puts us in the best position to do that for our customers.
Great. Thanks for that clarification. Is Athena on the call? She's not.
I haven't seen her in the chat or on the participant list here.
I am seeing my colleague Brooke Trammell come off mute. Brooke, did you want to add anything?
I was just going to add our understanding, the expectation of the RFP, and certainly how we conduct resource solicitations at Excel, is that the RFP is all source. So just to reiterate Zoe's point, by limiting the technologies that could be bid into an RFP, that is by definition no longer an all source competitive solicitation.
Great. Thank you, Brooke.
Can I just add one observation? It's maybe sometimes hard to tell in your guys' table, but there is a scenario that is looking at only adding zero carbon resources, right? This is the I'm going to forget the name, but so the numbers underlying the statement of need, take into consideration, and if it's explicitly modeled, a scenario with no new gas resources.
Great. Thanks, Jay. That's helpful, especially for people who hadn't been involved in the details of the modeling conversation. So thank you for pointing that out.
And I think some of the assumptions on that also are that new gas converts. Right. And we've talked a lot about the fuel for some of those technologies converting in the future.
Right. Great. Yes, Zoe, I'm ready for you to go on and address the third and fourth bullets on this in terms of the conversation that's been had about the high end of the resource needs and the range and inclusion and mention of demand side resources in the statement of needs. So can you address those two?
Sure, I'll take the first bullet point, the mid to high ranges of the resource need. We're continuing to talk to staff about that. And as Ben did explain when he was making his presentation, that the range of resources or the range of need identified in the IRP really is based off of the load forecasting modeling that we as a company have done, and also the forecast that our customer stakeholders in this process have asked us to evaluate. And just we thank them for engaging in that way and having us, providing us the data to evaluate that that load forecast. So we've presented the range of need in part so that when it comes time for the RFP, we can have a competitive RFP, but we also plan on, as Ben mentioned, ensuring that the RFP is based off the most recent load forecast at that time to try and tighten up that range. Also, it wasn't mentioned on the slides above, but I do want staff to know, because I know they're concerned about this, and we'll be discussing this a little further on in the action plan slide, but SPS will be comparing the cost of extending gas steam against the cost of new resources in that RFP. So I know a lot of the concern staff has about that large range is concerns regarding affordability. So we share those concerns, and we are actively looking at ways that we can address that in the action plan. We'll be discussing that further later on in this meeting.
Great, thank you. And I see we do have some members from PRC Utility Division staff on the call. Would you like to comment on your sense of this issue? Obviously, since you raised it at the last meeting, where do you stand on this issue?
Hi, this is Cynthia Mitchell, PRC's consultant. And thank you very much, both Ben and Zoe, for that. I'll send you right now in the chat what is my best understanding of what is our position based on discussion with Ed Rilkoff this morning prior to a great update conversation with Ben and Zoe. So it reads and follows very much along, I think, what Ben and Zoe are both stating. My understanding is that we're going to stay in a non-committal position right now as to the saying whether that upper end of the range is the quantity of new capacity appropriate, and that's distinct from whatever range SPS goes out for in their RFP. But this, as I understand, as Ed understands the statement of need, it's distinct from the RFP. So as Ben and Zoe have both said, we're looking forward to the updates on the load forecast, including most particularly anything regarding changes to the oil and gas loads, and then extensions of those existing gas generation units and possible PPA renewals prior to the 24 RFP that I believe will be in June or July.
Thank you, Cynthia. That's helpful. So we can come back to these next steps in the action plan when we get there. And I thank you very much for being so clear on the staff's position. We realize it's challenging, but it's helpful to have this in the chat. Thank you for both describing it and submitting it.
Okay, and just one more thing, Margie, I will make sure Ed reviews the specific language that I've offered here, even though it's very similar to something he's already looked at prior, but I'll make sure he takes his red pen to it in any way that he wants and gets that back to you, okay?
That would be great. Thank you, Cynthia. Our request is, but if we can get that by noon on Friday of this week, that would be fabulous.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. And we really appreciate staff's willingness to engage with us on this particular issue. The last bullet point on the range of demand side resources in the statement of need. So DSM assumptions were included in the modeling for this, and the statement of need range does reflect those assumptions. Specific DSM programs, and again, it's hard to delineate between our discussion of the statement of need and the action plan, so I'm going a little bit forward, but just specific demand side resource programs, we will address those in other regulatory processes, such as the energy efficiency filings, which are more appropriate to discuss those programs. But certainly in the load forecast, the updated load forecast that we use to tighten the range in the RFP will include updated DSM assumptions in that forecast as well.
So I don't see Michael Kenny on the call. Did I miss Michael? Are you on the call?
He was on here earlier.
Yeah, I see him.
Oh, there he is.
Great. I'd like to ask for your reaction and thought to that. I believe that the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project has been very clear in requesting that there be some mention of demand side resources in the statement of need, and then of course have suggested some action plan items. So Michael, are you feeling satisfied with the response and the current version of statement of need, or how do you feel about it?
I mean, I guess when we met previously, my hope was to see it, the modeled megawatts at least be included along with what we're seeing in the other categories. And I understand that, specific programs are not going to be, done through the IRP. They're going to come through the efficiency proceedings. But I do think it'd be important within this to elaborate on what demand side resources are currently offering and what, in the short term they're expected to provide. And to the extent, that SPS modeled outwards of, 2025, 2026, what was happening there. And so that way we're seeing somewhat of an apples to apples of over the range that this IRP is gonna be considering.
So Michael, this is Zoe. Some of this is addressed in the IRP itself, and I'm wondering if maybe it would be good for us to meet ahead of filing the IRP to discuss that specific section in the IRP. I also think some of these, future assumptions and future IRPs will also be determined by those future energy efficiency filings. So that's also part of it too, just recognizing that this is a dynamic process with future filings going on during the action period. But certainly willing to set something up ahead of filing, Michael, to talk it through with you a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that would be fine. Be happy to look at what you guys are going to do within the IRP, how you're going to frame it.
Great. So I think that will be a follow-on action. I also, SWEEP was not the only organization that identified this. If you go back to the statement of need from the interim committee, there was clearly envisioned a blank line with megawatts of contribution from demand side resources. So yeah, I understand that there can't be a commitment about future delivery from demand side, but I think Michael is asking, and others were asking for at least the mention, the visibility of the role, even if it's currently limited, but the role of demand side resources as part of the statement of needs. So I'm going to strongly encourage that conversation, to, even if it's just a statement about assumptions or something that really makes it visible in the statement of need. I think that was the intent of many of our stakeholders. Great, thank you. So we'll look forward to that update conversation that you might have. I see we have a note in the chat from Cynthia. The staff support SWEEP's comments regarding demand side management and appreciate Zoe's offer to discuss with Michael how to frame it in the IRP. Cynthia, let me ask, would you like to be part of that conversation based on your comment?
If it's not too difficult to include me, that would be great. I appreciate it.
Not at all, Cynthia, and I'm already sending a message to folks to help me set something up for us fairly quickly. So
Great, thank you, Zoe, appreciate that. So those were the 4 main issues that people discussed in our last meeting. Let me open it up then now to any other stakeholders who have concerns or comments about the statement of need or have questions. So over to anybody who's got a question. And Jay, if you have any additional observations, feel free to jump in as well.
Looking around the chat and participant list here, if any other questions. Not seeing any, Margie.
Okay.
I just had one, I don't know if it's part question, part observation, and Cynthia, has to do with your comment here on the upper end of the resource need range. And I want to clarify, right? SPS has modeled variable resources and dispatchable resources separately. Variable resources have a capacity contribution, but they're generally an energy resource, as I understood it. And that's their basis of selection in the modeling, was that they provided lower cost energy over the term. The combined number you're citing here adds both together, and it looks big because there was, they had modeled, pretty low cost wind and expecting 4.5, I think it was about 4.5 gigawatts. Now, when they do their RFP, they're going to consider all these factors, and particularly I think on the energy resource, there'll be a tight screen on the cost effectiveness. The capacity number is the one that they need for reliability purposes, and was lower than the 10,000. So I guess I want to just clarify, that's just everyone's understanding. Maybe call on SPS folks to further clarify how those evaluations will happen, and again, try and bring some comfort. Again, that looks like a big number, but I think when you break it down on how it was modeled, there's more detail to understand there. So I don't know who else wants to comment and respond to that, or we can move on.
No, I think that's really helpful, Jay. Thank you.
Or I guess maybe Zoe, can you, I mean, right, again, it was the bottom bullet point in the first, your review process in developing the most cost-effective portfolio eventually to submit it contemplates all of those steps in evaluation.
Yeah, that's right. And it's in, I think one thing that is good to remember is that the range of need brought forward in a resource portfolio is also going to be dependent on what the resources are in those portfolios. And that's why you see, I think Jay, that's where you were getting at. That's why you see such a large range, is because we did model different scenarios of resources coming through. So no, that's helpful, Jay. Someone just sent in a.
Yeah, unless there's further follow-up on this. James Hall, you say you have a question on transmission?
I do.
Yeah,
If
go
now's
ahead,
the right
James.
time to ask the question, Jay. So this is a lot of information about resources, which is great, and ExxonMobil certainly support the sort of flexible approach and the pragmatic approach of waiting for 6 to 8 months to understand and sort of further sharpen the pencil on what the load may be, right? Because it's a pretty dynamic environment. So that's all well and good. And I know that where the generation is going to be is not necessarily known now, and that a lot of the generation hopefully will be at existing places that already has interconnection, which sort of addresses transmission. But presumably there'll still be the need for some broad transmission expansion and planning to be able to make sure that all the resources are getting to where the load is. In a 3-year time frame, is there any sort of tactical specific things that have to be done to, to marry the generation with transmission, to make sure that that's not a bottleneck and you've got all this stuff ready to go, but you're not able to get it where it needs to go? Maybe that was talked about before, I don't recall, so I just wanted to throw that out there.
I think I want to hand it over to the SPS team, but I believe a lot of those details are going to be captured too. Along with any bids, there'd be some sort of interconnection study looking at this, as well as reliability modeling. I think those were additional screens that we talked about in prior settings here, but I want to let the SPS team confirm that or correct me.
Yep, I was going to jump in, but I'll let Brooke talk first. She has her hand up.
Thanks all. Hi, James. Yep, good question. And you're right, we will, as Jay said, have, as we've talked about in this group, modeling on the interconnection costs. Those are assumed at the mid price, but I think you're asking also about network transmission upgrades or other transmission infrastructure or equipment that may need to support the generation fleet transition and the addition of new resources, particularly variable energy resources on the system. I think in one of our first stakeholder meetings, you heard me say location does matter, right? Where the new gen shows up will have transmission implications. So replacement generation strategies can avoid new transmission investment. But we know with the resource need this large, we're not going to be able to fit all the new gen into places where existing gen's retiring. So there probably will be some transmission build out. I think that evaluation occurs in a couple of ways through the bid evaluation process. When we're looking at actual projects, it also falls into a reliability assessment that'll be a part of the bid evaluation and discussion in further regulatory processes. To the extent we do have some network upgrades or transmission expansion or transmission investment that's necessitated to bring the new generation portfolio online, those would be likely, depending on the voltage and different things, likely proposed via an NMPRC CCN, transmission CCN applications as well. So that could be a follow-on regulatory process, James, of this IRP planning process in the time frame for when that new gen would need to be online.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. So the reliability assessment's kind of key to trigger that further assessment need. That's great. Thanks, Brooke.
You bet.
And before I go to Michael, you've got your hand raised. James, if you think of something specific that you think should be included as an action item on this transmission question, feel free to bring that up in our next subject conversation after the break. So Good question. Michael, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks. I just had I guess a quick clarifying question about what the final IRP would look like in terms of the stakeholder requests. So how are those going to be incorporated into the draft? And to what amount of detail would be added?
So thanks, Michael. So right now, in both the statement of need and action plan sections, we are identifying issues stakeholder input that we were able to reach a consensus on, and identifying non-consensus items. We'll also be attaching, the plan is right now is attaching as much of the stakeholder engagement materials as possible so that we can show the commission it's not just us describing what the stakeholder input is, but the commission can see that as well. I don't know if that is helpful.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking more specific to like the modeling runs that were done at stakeholder requests. If there'll be a section on, here's like a list of scenarios that we received as a request, and here's what we ran, and here were the general results, or what that would look like, because they're not necessarily informing the statement of need that you guys are moving forward with, but they were part of the larger discussion and might inform future IRPs or future kind of decisions that we want to pursue.
Sure. It's been a few days, Michael, since I've gotten into the modeling section of the IRP ahead of this call, but we do discuss the stakeholder engagement process and the process we went through in order to the process we went through with stakeholders on the modeling inputs.
Okay.
So I think, so we might ask for you all to have a look at that in the next, as you're putting this together, and let us know how or if the stakeholder requested modeling runs, how they will or will not be addressed in the IRP as stakeholder input. Obviously, that was an activity for modeling that is not a required area to be spoken to in the IRP. The areas that were required to be described in terms of agreement or non-agreement, resolution or non-resolution, is the statement of need and the action plan. So I think you have some latitude on how you might handle that, but it sounds like Michael's asking for some clarity on how those runs will be represented, if they will be in the
they will be. We will definitely be representing the stakeholder requested runs and summarizing the results. I'm not prepared to go into like the level of detail on this call, but we can definitely follow up, Michael, on that.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Michael,
that all sounds great.
Great. See, I think we've going to take a short break before we switch to the action plan. I remind folks that if you have additional questions, you can put them into the chat, or you can email them to info@gridworks.org by this Friday at noon. That instruction will come back up later in our slide deck, but please don't feel like this is your only opportunity. And as Arthur pointed out, there's also opportunities to file public comment after the plan is submitted. So I show our time as 2:34. Given that we're a little behind schedule, I'd like to take a 6-minute break and resume at 2:40 Mountain Time. Again, today it's right now it's 2:34. Let's give a 6-minute break and come back at 2:40 p.m. Thank you so much for the input so far. Welcome back, and thank you for that discussion. We'll now shift to conversation about the action plan, and we'll turn the meeting back over to the SPS team to share their incredibly amazing crosswalk diagram that they've put together to map action plan ideas. And so, Zoe, back to you and your team. You'd like to describe your slides on statement of need. Would you like me to share my screen?
I think Linda is on and can share. Yep. Great. So this slide just presents where we were kind of at the end of the stakeholder meeting on September 13th. We had a lot of items in the SPS suggested action plan items and comment items. I kind of grouped those together because I don't think there was a lot of disagreement with what was in the SPS suggested action plan items. So you'll see a lot of those come on over into this middle column. And then there were a list of stakeholder suggestion action plan items that were provided for us to consider as we develop the drafted IRP. So this was the status of where we were on September 13th, and the homework that SPS had was to take the list and the stakeholder suggested action plan items and consider that list. So we'll go on to the next slide. And here's a visual of where we landed, and then when I'll go on to the next slide and kind of give you more explanation on what didn't make it into this middle column. So first, we heard from a lot of our stakeholders that reliability, resiliency, and affordability is very important to them. So in the action plan, you will see the prioritization of reliability, resiliency, and affordability, and you'll see that folded in to developing bid evaluation documents that address these issues, especially on the reliability front. I'm trying to decide the best way to go through this. So I'm going to stick with the stakeholder suggested action plan column. The next action plan item was from staff and asking us to analyze or study how to reduce oil and gas connected load through voluntary programs and or special services contracts. So in the action plan item, you will see that we have committed to evaluating the Renewable Connect voluntary program once it's approved. That is a voluntary program for large industrial customers. We've committed to evaluating and analyzing whether to expand that program, and we've committed to analyzing other possible program offerings for large industrial customers. Going down the list again of the stakeholder suggested action plan items, the request that we analyze and study interruptible tariffs for high tech and other loads. If you're in the action plan, you will see that we will be including an interruptible tariff request in our upcoming energy efficiency reconciliation filing. That is forthcoming and will come pretty quickly after filing this IRP. Staff had requested that we explore PPA extensions. If we are addressing that in the action plan by stating that we are going to develop an all-source RFP for resource need in the 2028-2030 timeframe that includes PPA extensions. And then also, I'll just say this again, that, and it's not specifically stated on the slide, but you will also see that SPS will commit to comparing the cost of extending the gas steam resources that we have on the system today against the cost of new resources in the RFP. And finally, the load management and time of use, pursue time varying rates as part of grid modernization. In the action plan, you'll see that we identified that we already have, SPS already has time varying rates. However, we will conduct a time of use study per the rate case stipulation. So those are how we're folding in those specific stakeholder suggested action plans into this list. And that those are items that we hadn't yet discussed with stakeholders yet. There were some that we had already moved over, I know, into this middle column. Any questions on that?
Hey, so yeah, can you talk about the item that's now in purple in the common items, the demand response? Because I think that was as common, although there's a phrase in the suggestion from stakeholders that's not incorporated into that action item. It was about initiating a stakeholder process to design appropriate program. I know that didn't get translated to the sender. Can you talk about that?
Oh, sure. And in the energy efficiency filings where we evaluate these types of program offerings, we have a stakeholder engagement process that goes on ahead of those filings already. I mean, many of you have probably been involved in that process with our regulatory department ahead of filing the interruptible credit option request in the energy efficiency reconciliation. So we do have a stakeholder engagement process that is folded into that. And also we have stated this before, that we are committed to continuing our stakeholder engagement on the IRP, on this resource planning process, even beyond the formal engagement process ahead of filing it. So of course, we're always open to stakeholder engagement on these issues. So it was an oversight if it didn't get folded in explicitly, and we'll address it.
Great, thanks.
So I think we can go to the next slide, and I'll just address those items that didn't make it over. Oh, sure. It looks like we have some questions.
I was gonna pause and ask the people who suggested.
I thought there weren't any since we had paused, but it looks like there are. So
go ahead, Cynthia.
Thank you. Is it Zoe or Brooke? I'm so sorry, I lost track of the voices.
So Zoe is talking right now, and Brooke
Okay.
will certainly chime in.
Okay. Zoe, just a moment ago, and then I think earlier also, you or Ben stated that the consideration of extensions of the existing gas resources would go through the RFP and be compared to possible new projects. Is that what you said?
They wouldn't go through the RFP, Cynthia, but we'll compare the cost of extending those gas resources to the resources that come through the RFP. So they're already on our system. I don't think we need to, they need to go through a competitive process.
Right. And then as we've spoken, that's somewhat of an apples to oranges comparison, because it's most likely it only makes sense to do a short-term extension, 3 years or so at most, per the Excel Colorado recent findings. And then potential new gas projects would be, longer lived, longer life, 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, Cynthia, I think it would depend on the resource and specifically what the status of the resources on the ground, and when we decide how long to extend it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and Cynthia, this is Brooke. There's probably some PSCO specifics, some uniqueness that was driving that scenario, but agree with Zoe's comments.
Okay, great, thank you.
To the others, I have a couple more questions that arose. Zoe, in the you mentioned the priority of reliability, resiliency, and affordability as being key in the RFP evaluation. This says actions to be determined there. I think you just stated that those will be criteria in the RFP bid documents. Is there anything more specific that you want to say about that?
Well, we do have to develop, bid evaluation documents on reliability and resiliency. We haven't done that yet, but those will be filed ahead of the issuing the RFP per the IRP rule. And there is a comment process on those bid documents as well that I want to point out. So some of this, the detail, we're not ready to share because we're still drafting this IRP, but just so stakeholders understand, the process isn't over with the filing of this RFP on some of these issues. There's more process built into the IRP rule.
Right, okay. And then the other general question is, there aren't many specific dates in these common items, so that one, I'm thinking of the commission or others that want to check completion of action items against what was committed to. I think that's, you all have the opportunity to give an annual update on your action plan. So I don't know if you have thoughts about putting specific timelines on these actions. I think that would be helpful for stakeholders to see that.
No, and you had brought this up yesterday, Margie, and we have, the timeline that we originally presented to this group. I think that timeline's on your website, but we're working to try and add a little bit more detail to that for folks. So it wasn't ready for mass consumption today, but we'll be working on that.
Yeah, and Zoe and Margie, I would add some of the items here, the timing of them will be dependent on commission action.
Yes.
So we have several items in the list that are either currently pending commission evaluation and approval or will be. So we can estimate some of the timelines for those milestones down the road, but we just caveat it that a lot of these things are going to be pretty highly dependent on commission's approval of other options.
That's right. Thanks, Brooke.
An example would be file the CCN PPA approvals, right? We know we have to file those, it's required, but that's going to be a product of the timing of the RFP issuance and the project evaluation selection. Another example would be
I'll jump in with another example.
ICO. Yeah, the ICO that's going in the EE reconciliation filing, Renewable Connect, which is a proceeding pending before the commission now. So, as the commission approves and considers those cases, that'll influence when we can do subsequent activities. Also, I'll just point out that the commission still has our grid modernization application pending from July of 2022. So in terms of our proposed advanced meter deployment in New Mexico, that is still undecided at this point in New Mexico. And so our meter deployment as proposed has continued to be pushed out as we await the commission's decision in that proceeding.
Right. Yeah, no, we totally understand. There's some moving parts that are not within SPS's control. So I totally appreciate that. For those stakeholders who are not intimate and participating in all of the normal regulatory proceedings, we believe it's helpful to inform stakeholders about what the pace of things would be, and if there are items within SPS's control, what dates would you commit to doing them? For example, your RFP bid documents, if indeed the suggestion earlier was to review and update the oil and gas load profile before issuing that, then that'll have a specific dependency with that RFP timeline. And so where we can inform stakeholders about where things fit together and what things are within SPS's control, I think it would be helpful, but we do not have another opportunity scheduled for you all to update stakeholders.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit of a loss of how to.
Sure, Margie, and just on the RFP documents, as you know, that is also highly dependent on commission action or no action on our IRP. So again, lots of dependencies here. I think the Gantt chart that we provided at the top of this engagement process gives a really good estimate timeline on some of those procedural matters that are folded into this action plan. But like Brooke said, a lot of it is also highly dependent on the regulatory process itself. Sorry, Brooke, did you have something to add?
I was just going to say, I think what we can do though is try to Margie's point, note the interdependencies.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
You know, try to reflect which items are tied together, and if there is a pending proceeding that one is dependent on, at least just make the connection. And Zoe, defer to you on where that belongs or where that fits nicely into the October filing, or later in the process. But I think we can try to map that out, Margie. That seems to be the intention you're headed towards, which I think we agree is helpful.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as I said at the top, we are working to try and update that timeline that we provided at the beginning of this process to reflect that. So.
Okay, great. Yeah, so you want to continue then? And are there other questions though that people have? We will come back to this and ask for the stakeholders who had suggestions on this list on the right-hand column. Do you have any comments about them? Is the wording that's captured in the center reflective of your intent? We certainly want to hear from stakeholders on any of this that you feel like you would like to comment on. Seeing none right now, Zoe, would you like to continue?
Yeah, so you'll see in the action plan section of the IRP that we do address those items in which there were no consensus. So I'll take them one by one. We've categorized them in 3 different ways. So first, where you see requires more discussion in future forums, that is by no means us closing the door to that action plan item. It's just that there's either another regulatory proceeding that is more appropriate to address those items in, or it requires further engagement with stakeholders on those particular items. And certainly when it comes to the special services contracts that staff was interested in, you know, I think Brooke discussed this on the 13th, but this, you know, 2 parties to those contracts. And so we would have to take those, any interest in contracts like that on a case-by-case basis and analyze and consider those individually. The second category addressed in other commission proceedings, that I think is pretty self-explanatory, especially when it comes to some of the energy efficiency and demand side resources that we've been discussing today. Those will be discussed in our energy efficiency filings. And then for category 3, that category relates, many of the items that category is in relation to were included kind of granular emission related issues. And SPS believes that what needs to guide the RFP evaluation are the IRP rule itself and the requirements in the Energy Transition Act. So that's what we mean when we say the legal and regulatory issues and considerations with the request, is we're really looking to what the law is in New Mexico under those two acts when considering how we're going to be evaluating the bids. And I'll pause there, Margie.
Are there
And Cynthia,
questions?
I'm seeing your comment, and thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Cynthia, I don't understand your comment. So let's ask you to clarify. Staff appreciates assignment of category 1. Does that mean you agree with it, or you don't agree with it, or you acknowledge it?
We agree with it. This is exactly what we wanted or envisioned with the notion of exploring the use of special use contracts or special service contracts or other mechanisms, that we would have it as an action item, and that it wouldn't be, it's not an action item in the plan per se, but that it was something we could discuss with SPS after the plan's filed, and see where we get with it by the time staff files its report, and or where it otherwise fits more appropriately in the range or the mix of, commission regulatory proceedings. So this is just fine with us, in other words.
Thank you. So I guess a question that I have, since some of our stakeholders who suggested things in category 3 that are not here, is your plan to give more specific response besides just saying it's legal and regulatory issue? Are you planning to make some kind of sentence or statement in the plan that gives more specificity, like things that are driven by the Energy Transition Act? Are you going to give a more tailored response to each item, or going to leave them in these category designations?
Margie, we will have tailored responses to the items. As you know, we're still drafting the IRP. So, and as every slide states in our presentation, is that it's still subject to internal review and final executive approval. So we've been trying to provide as much information to stakeholders in this process as we can, and that we can, considering that we have kind of two processes going, getting internal sign off on everything contained in the document and sharing with you what's going into that document. So the answer is yes, Margie.
That's great. And so I guess I would like, if anybody else who's suggested these items has a concern about how they're being treated as in this category, or is not, they have issue with these being unadopted, we want to hear from people today or by Friday at noon. So any comment from folks about this unadopted list of action plan items? Great. Any comments about anything on the action plan at this point? Then we'll review our questions we had for folks here in a moment. But is there any other question or comment on the action plan? I'm scanning through the chat. But please come off mute or raise your hand or submit a question and answer if you'd like to speak. All right, let's shift back, Deb, to the GridWorks slide deck. And let's run down the list of questions in case that spurs any comment from our group as well. I think it's slide number 7, please, Deb. And here are the set of questions we thought of in case this generates any other reaction or thought. Is the language for the common items acceptable? Is each item clear regarding what it entails? Recognizing that is still work in process, but stakeholders have an opportunity until Friday of this week to add any comments there. We already asked if the issues raised previously by stakeholders in our discussion of the action plan were addressed, but please comment if you have additional thoughts. Do stakeholders have comments regarding the unadopted list of action plan items, and particularly if anyone disagrees that something on the unadopted list needs to be adopted, we'd like to hear from you. Do stakeholders have any other concerns or comments? And then, as we already discussed with the SPS team, would stakeholders, we in GridWorks believe that there would be value, and if the stakeholders don't agree, please speak up, but having some sort of summary of actions, timeline, understanding how these relate to other preceding references in the action plan, giving our stakeholders some sort of roadmap or connection of the action plan items, because unless you're fully immersed in and living day to day in the regulatory world, it might be a little hard for some of our stakeholders to follow. So thank you, Zoe and Brooke, for offering to refine that roadmap with the milestones and help our stakeholders navigate this future. Any other comments and from stakeholders, or Jay, is there anything you'd like to add regarding our action plan conversation?
I'll let the others go for it. I had one small clarification, but I want to make sure everyone else has opportunity for questions, discussion.
Cynthia, feel free to come off mute and ask your questions.
Thank you, Margie. I don't need to ask these questions. I just wanted to pass them on to SPS. We mentioned these, or we discussed these just very briefly this morning, and I said I would put them in writing in the chat for them today. And I think they really pertain to the statement of need, and there's no urgency in getting answers to these prior to the filing. And if they're going to be incorporated in the filing, that's great. Otherwise, sometime after the filing, when it is convenient, is when we would like the responses.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Marty, just so we want to make sure how we handle this, because it's like, so Cynthia, you have your questions in the chat here. I guess we can document them. Right. I mean, I'm also, I mean, this gets to the end that as this gets filed at the commission, there's some pretty strict timelines on comments and decisions. So I don't think the responses to these can't kind of just sit indefinitely. So I want to make sure how we document this and they're treated by the SPS team.
So my recommendation is because these are specific to results from the modeling, which we've finished in the integrated into the facilitated stakeholder process, that we would simply we share the chat with SPS, and then they can have those questions in mind as they go forward. I don't think this is part of the the specific stakeholder deliverables at this point, but we will certainly make this information available to the SPS team. That's my recommendation. Are you okay with that, Jay?
Just looking at the list, I think that's okay as long as we don't need further clarification of the question. But I guess this is also for the SPS team.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And no, Cynthia, thank you for putting these questions into the chat. We'll look at them, and as you said, as we discussed earlier, we understand that you don't necessarily need an answer on these by the 13th. We'll certainly look at them and try and get that information to you in a timely manner, and we'll continue our engagement with you on these questions. So
Okay.
I wasn't, in talking to you, I wasn't clear that I wasn't under the impression that these needed to be resolved by our filing, that these were just follow-up items you wanted to make sure we continue to engage on with you.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Zoe. If I get these down on paper, then I don't lose them.
Yeah, and it's helpful for us to have them in writing too. Thank you,
Okay,
Cynthia.
thank you.
Jay, did you have another point, a clarification you wanted to add?
Yeah, it was a little more if we go back to the action plan list of common items on the RFI for long lead time resources.
Yes.
There was in the parentheses, it talked about under internal consideration, and I know that was the status as of last month when it came up. Is that still the case?
Yeah, we're still running traps on it internally, Jay, but we are still including it in that column because we're hopeful that we will be able to do that.
Okay, yeah, that was just clarification. I didn't have any others.
Any other questions by stakeholders of things in the action plan at this point? So I'm going to take a risk and summarize where we are from today's conversation before we go to what's next. And Deb, if you'll go to slide number 10, I'm going to try my summary, and then I'm going to ask Zoe, you and your team to offer your closing comments. I think where we are on the statement of need is, in my mind, there are two, as of right now, there remain two unresolved topics in the statement of need. One being the treatment of the range of new resources, and the second being the mention and of demand side resources as a statement of need element. I believe those are two things that are unresolved, and there's some action items taken to have for future conversations with stakeholders on those. But at this point in the process, I believe those are unresolved. On this action plan, I believe there are many items that are still being worked and clarified in the action plan. So I don't know that we can enumerate things that are unresolved, except in general, there's continued refinement and description of those common items in the action plan. It sounds to me like items that were in the stakeholder list that were unadopted. I don't think that's an open item. I think we didn't hear from anybody that said that those items that were unadopted should be in the center mid column, the common column. So I believe that is resolved. Things that are not adopted, and it sounds like there's agreement to that. But there are still some details of the common items that are still being worked. I'm going to stop here and first ask my colleague Jay if you agree with my synopsis, and then we'll ask SPS for your synopsis of where we are after today. Go ahead, Jay.
I think I want to offer a couple caveats. One, well, two. I mean, I think a couple things. One, we look at the statement of need and the demand forecast. I think everyone, to be fair, the high end forecast was a stakeholder request. That was not SPS's kind of internally generated. You know, the modeling group has looked at, reviewed, but I think partially in the interest of you know, acknowledging and honoring stakeholder requests, SPS has, you know, included that in their analysis all the way through. So I just want, I guess, again, the whole group to understand that. And I think as part of their managing that, as we've heard about here, you know, they're going to continue to tighten their forecast into the future as they develop and scope the RFP. So I guess, you know, that's my observation of what's happened. I'll let SPS team weigh in as well, but I just want to make sure that's understood by all here. And then two, I think if we look at the list in the middle from where we started last month, I think there are some important considerations that SPS is making to address demand side resources. It will, you know, subject to what happens. I think, you know, offered to look at, study and review these options. So I think that is a step beyond where things were where we started. It's not a affirmative commitment to certain levels of resources. I would know, you know, given the large capacity need here in particular, it's an important resource you need to look at to manage the risk of what you're trying to go through. It's something we've been through here. You know, we generated more demand side megawatts in a year than we did for many utility scale projects as we were dealing with a coal plant retirement. So I just wanted, for the group's benefit, not lose sight of the importance of that resource, but also acknowledge that, you know, they have taken more steps to commit to action there. With that, I think, you know, I want to mostly thank everyone's time and effort put into this. I think we have come a long way, and it's something that hasn't been tried for this utility and state. So we weren't sure where it'd end up. I think we've made more progress than maybe anticipated, but there are still lingering threads as we get to the end here. Let's see, Brooke has her hand up.
Hey, thanks, Jay. Hey, I just want to thank you for those comments. I just want to offer a little numerical perspective on some of the current proposals that we have from an SPS system perspective, from an ICO program standpoint. We've talked a lot about, like you said, the demand side potential and the value there. And then this isn't meant to be a comprehensive response to what you're saying. I agree with the ongoing evaluation there, right? And the evaluation of value of demand side resources. But from an interruptible credit option perspective, you know, we have seen a lot of oscillation in customer interest in programs like that over time, you know, over decades. And so we have some learnings of, you know, high penetration of that kind of customer involvement of those kind of options in the past. Like I say, they've oscillated down. Some of that oscillation has removed some of those tariffs from our tariff book and the availability of them. And we, you know, we see that coming back obviously now with the resource need that we have. And these two items are both still pending before both the New Mexico Commission and the Texas Commission in current rate proceedings. And so I don't want to offer, you know, too much comment there because there are active proceedings, but largely we have a roughly 85 megawatt cap on ICO program in Texas today and no ICO program in New Mexico, given some of that oscillating history I've referenced. But with proposals that we have made over the last year and that are pending before both commissions in our electric retail service territory here in SPS, you know, we're looking to increase those programs into the several hundred megawatt ranges, right? So that just is a representation of some of the evolution of some of our demand side offerings, as well as the DSM and energy efficiency, other measures that Zoe was talking about in those filings. So this is a little bit of me just kind of seconding your comments, Jay, and reiterating the company's interest in evaluating those programs and bringing those proposals before our regulators for consideration. So I know we've talked about the specifics of where things go in the statement of need and where the common items are, but if we just go up 100,000 feet, we've got some proposals that we've been making over the last year or so, and information before our commissions on where we think there can be value there. So it's an evolution. There's a lot to these IRP processes, but appreciate your comments there on the demand response side.
Yeah, thanks, Brooke. That's helpful. And I think that context, that commitment, that awareness is something that stakeholders have asked for. Well, like to see mention of what that is in the statement of need, and whatever form it takes. I'm hearing from the stakeholders that recognition that may be important should show up in the statement of need. So however you all want to describe it, and would be, I think, a useful addition to the statement of need, is why I bring it up as perhaps an unresolved issue. Stakeholders have not seen that written in the material so far on statement of need. So thanks for considering what might be included in that. I'm glad to hear that it's important to you. It sounds like it's important to our stakeholders too. So I would like to give you an opportunity to do your version of what you've heard in terms of what's resolved, what's not, and how stakeholders can stay informed of these future conversations that are going to be happening.
And thanks, Brooke, for kind of taking us to that 10,000 foot view. So I think in terms of mentioning DSM, we're going to meet with Michael, Kenny, and staff just to get a better understanding of what they'd like to see in the statement of need, and whether we've addressed it sufficiently. On the treatment of range of resources, so my understanding from staff is that they are going to remain non-committal on the upper end of the megawatt range on that statement of need. I think recognizing that there's no prudence findings in the IRP, that it's an acceptance of a plan, but not an approval or a prudence filing. SPS is pretty comfortable with that position on staff's, just recognizing that there are subsequent regulatory proceedings in which the size of the resource portfolio that we bring forward will be addressed, and we don't expect staff to make any statements in this IRP that to the prudency of that at this time. So I'm actually, I don't know, I'll leave it to staff in terms of whether they feel that this is an issue that's not resolved yet, but to me, I think that we are on the same page with staff that there's no prudence finding in this IRP as to the size of that. And I'm recognizing, Cynthia, that Ed's not on the call, so you might not be able to really address that, and we can certainly circle back outside of this meeting to make sure we're all on the same page.
That's my own interpretation of the regulation as it's written, that there is no prudency determination.
And then on the action plan items, I think we just need to wait and see, Margie, until Friday, what folks say. I'm hopeful. I think that the input on the action plan was very helpful to SPS, and that we were able to incorporate a lot of those items into our action plan as well. So that's where I'm at, and I just again want to thank everybody for their engagement. I think this has been, like I said, extremely valuable to SPS. And we have been able to incorporate so much of your input into the statement of need, into the action plan. We appreciate your engagement during the past 6 months on this. And also just want to say thank you to GridWorks for your facilitation of this process. I think without that facilitation and the framework that you provided, we probably wouldn't have come as far as we have. So thank you so much to Margie and Jay and to Deb for your hard work. We'll continue the stakeholder engagement past this. SPS is committed to continuing these conversations with all of you. And we are looking forward to filing on the 13th and moving on to the next step in this process. So thank you all.
Thanks, Zoe, for those words and for the acknowledgement. We really appreciate the teaming with you. We have a huge thanks to every stakeholder who either was here today or participated in a meeting or gave input throughout this 6-month process. That was very valuable to have the diverse perspectives that we had. Want to remind people that we have till noon on this Friday of any other comments about the statement of need and action plan that you would like to be registered as input from you. Please include the words SPS IRP in the subject line of the email so that it gets categorized in the right project area. And Deb, if you go to the next slide, please. Just review then what happens next. Noon on Friday, any other comments? October 26th, we'd like to invite all stakeholders to a meeting to give us your total feedback on the process since it's been going on the past 6 months. What worked for you? What do you think should be considered in future IRP stakeholder processes so that we can provide that as input to the New Mexico PRC? Our GridWorks will present our report to the Commission by the end of January 2024, and that will include the result of this process as well as the similar process being underway with the Public Service Company of New Mexico. And as Arthur mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, you can see on the left side of the right-hand side of this chart what happens after the filing. There'll be 30 days for written public comment. Then another 30 days or 60 days after filing, SPF's written comments are due. Then the PRC Utility Division will file their statement regarding compliance of the statement of need and action plan with the rule. And then, as he described, the Commission hasn't acted 120 days after filing, then the statement of need and action plan are deemed compliant. And then there's a whole set of activities for going into the RFP process that you can read in the IRP rule. We wanted to be sure that all of you understood that there are opportunities for stakeholders to engage in many of the follow-on activities, not just things that were in the action plan list, but also the RFP processes, some of the other proceedings that the team has described are opportunities for engagement by stakeholders. So please don't be discouraged if you don't understand them. Give some phone calls and get some guidance. Many of you are very expert already in intervening in those processes or participating. So please don't stop now. This is just the beginning, and we're looking forward to a very successful 20-year plan going forward to meet the reliability, affordability, and all the needs of the SPS customers. So with that, I'll give you one last slide here to get you thinking about what we'll be asking you for on October 26th. We'll be asking for what worked well. If you can't attend that meeting, or if you want to provide input in advance of our report, we'll give you till November 10th to give us any feedback that you have for the process over the past 6 months, so we can assemble that and deliver it to the PRC in January. So again, that's thinking from the very beginning to the end, what worked, what voices do you wish were in the audience, what things should be done differently, and we'll have a series of questions on that, but feel free to give us input anytime. And then before we give you our final thank you, we'll ask that you take a few minutes to fill out a survey from how today's meeting worked for you by either visiting this link, and Deborah has put that into the chat, or using your phone to scan this QR code and answer the 4 questions about how this meeting worked or didn't work for you and what suggestions you have for going forward. And with that, please find the meeting materials on the GridWorks website. We will be coming up with a summary of the meeting. And we are recording this, so the recording will be posted. And we'll also post any other input that we get on the action plan and statement of need by Friday noon. We will compile that and get that posted on the GridWorks website as well. So with all of that, Deborah, is there something that we forgot to inform or describe to our stakeholders at this point?
No, Margie, I think you've covered it all. We will get the meeting summary out today or first thing in the morning, and we'll give you some guidelines on when the next meeting is and what to expect. So thank you, Margie.
Great. Again, thank you so much for your time and engagement. We look forward to seeing you on the 26th, or at least hearing from you by then, or by middle of November, really, in terms of feedback. Thank you again, and we wish you the best of the rest of today. Thank you.